The elements raged with all their strength, with all the gods' cruel will, and Pontifex Sandris chanted. He, along with the lesser priests, had to yell their praises over the howling wind and the cracks from the ceremony fire. The wind turned the flames in a chaotic spiral, which licked his face when he dared approach. Pain became ecstasy in his passion. They were kisses from the fire god, who dances on the earths and in the stars and in the sun. The sea, not to be outdone, crashed against the cliffs like a raging titan, begging for release. His back was cold from the sea, his face hot from the fire. It was then that the Pontifex felt like the prophet he was. Now his gods were powerful. He could feel their touch, hear their voice. He could speak for them. Now he wasn't a tired, failing old man, but an avatar of the gods, of nature itself. His followers felt it too. Many had fallen to their knees, singing spells and incantations to the moon. Priestess Alimaya cast her alchemies into the flame, turning the tongues green or white. Their chanting was confused and chaotic, like the temperamental elements they were dedicated to. Their chaos pleased the gods, who raged their storm all the harder. He turned from the fire, which seemed to burn black on his eyes even when he wasn't looking, blinding him. All he could feel was the air flying past him, trying to take his frail body with it. It brought tears to his already strained eyes. Since boyhood he'd been devoted to the gods, but it was only now, in his old age, that he came to value their resilient intensity. Youth brought him energy, and time took it away, but the wind was blowing as willfully as it had in his 8th spring. That had been years and years ago. How many he did not know. It had been years even since he stopped counting. Wisdom is repayment for age, Sandris thought. Perhaps wisdom is stored in the knees, as the veins hold passion. That is why mine hurt worse and worse every night. Aches returned to his joints as the rush wore off. He turned to watch his fellows in their ceremony, dancing like moths around the light. All but one, a strange boy lurking in the shade. All Sandris could see was the shape of a body and a pale face illuminated by the tall column of fire. He was young, judging by the red pimples which dotted his face. Sandris had never seen him before, or at least never memorably. When the boy realized he had been spotted, by the Pontifex no less, he scuttled away. Let the meek fear me. I am the better for it, he thought. Fear had surrounded him once, too. From his master, from the gods. Only after his master died did Sandris learn not to fear him, and instead to emit fear. But he still feared the gods, and they demanded to be satisfied. Silence fell as the Pontifex's hand raised. He coughed a few times, then spoke. Bring the offerings, he said in his rough, deep voice. Obediently, baskets of berries, gems, and herbs were carried out by monks and brought to the fireside. At his nod, they were thrown into the flames. The herbs turned the smoke sweet and fragrant, but still it stung the eyes and nose. Lastly, the heart of a bull was offered, held aloft with 2 hands by Alimaya, her hands still covered in blood. Sandris could see the mass of viscera twitching with life, So fresh was the memory of its body. She brought the organ to him, and he accepted. It was powerfully muscular, a welcome gift for the spirits. The gods are wild and only respect the strong. With a prayer, he committed the heart to sacrifice. He saw the heart boil and writhe. It cooked and evaporated, turned to smoke and ash. In a matter of moments, the source of life was no more. Such is the way of fire. The smell of charred flesh mixed with the smoke as it rose into the dark, leaving the earths behind. That night he dreamt. Usually they were of the past, sometimes glimpses into the future. Sometimes he was animals or trees, sometimes he was himself. But this night he wasn't a man. He was a bull, ready for slaughter. The cruel edge of the blade felt cold and real in the depths of his mind. His heart was torn from his body and committed to a maw of hellfire. Once he had burnt, all he could see was darkness. All he could hear was silence. The old master looked at the apprentice quivering before him. In the dark tent, the glimmers of fear shone bright as stars in the boy's eyes, just as they had at the previous night's fire. The Pontifex prayed for him. Later he would make a sacrifice to make the boy stronger, a bitch dog or a fat old stallion. He had the look of spring about him, and not even the whisper of a beard, unlike Sandris's own, now long, white, and tangled. Perhaps I need a sacrifice of my own. A hare for speed, or a piglet for youth, he thought. The boy brought the sacred bones, the damn heavy thing, from its shrine. It shone white, the arcane runes drinking in the darkness. It trembled with the boy, who held the necklace delicately, as if it might bite. At the top were lesser gods of stars, their symbols spiral cuts on seashells. Farther down, carved onto rodent and bird skulls, were the harsher signs for the gods of the sky and earths. At the bottom sat the rune, surrounded by amber and ivory, a shard of whalebone with the massive flowing symbol, connecting them all, ruling them all. Blood of my blood, he prayed, turning back to that shivering thing holding his bones. He straightened his back with effort. Sandris was never a tall man, but now he felt his body crawling ever downward. Even when he sat, his knees seared like hot iron. He wondered which god to pray to for that. Now even the apprentice stood above him, slipping the bones over his head onto the raw red skin about his shoulders and neck. Sandris tried, as always, to resist the pull down to hunch, but he knew that by evenfall he would be bent and pained as a tree split by lightning. With a reverent bow, the apprentice turned to leave the pelt tent. "Stop," Sandris's voice rasped, turning the whelp to stone, if stone could shake. Soon, the Pontifex spoke again, his voice low, burnt from decades of ritual fires. "Bring me goat's milk," he said. It was easier on his bowels than that of cows. The boy must have expected something more frightening. "Yes, Pontifex," he squeaked, scurrying from the tent. He let in a burst of cool morning air when he left. "Blood, lead me," he said, clutching the bone close. The wind blew in cold from the Cunier Sea, which raged against the tall white cliffs. Sheer rock greeted his feet, as inhospitable as the morning. The sky was clear, at least, and the sun would grace his wrinkling flesh in a few hours. Their monastery was small, which was by design. Sandris's design. He would sooner stay away from prying eyes and unwanted visitors. He had nothing to hide but the disturbances for the endless ceremonies and blessings the throne required from him had grown too much. It seemed the feeling was mutual, as he hadn't received a summons in many blissful years. All he'd ever wanted was to please the gods and meditate somewhere quiet. But there was always something. There was always something, and there has been forever. Now, he had only a few in his pride, but they were as devoted to blood as the sea is to the moon. Sashaya was learning the healing ways, and was raising her children to be priests. She was young and fair to look on, but the children ensured there was always something to disturb him at any hour. Many came and went as they pleased. Pilgrims or vagrants, he did not care. All offered homage, and all were made welcome. Now, he could see only a few others beginning their days. Alimaya, of course, was awake even before him. She always loved to watch the sunrise, to pray silently as she beheld it. His scabs itched around his neck, and he scratched greedily. His pale eyes turned to watch the boy running towards him, a cup clutched in both hands. White liquid sloshed hither and thither out of the cup. Sandris's sunken gut purred at the thought of food, or perhaps it was growling at the sight of milk. "I have few pleasures in this pious life," he thought. "I won't give them away for the sake of my damn belly." "Boy," he said, remembering something the elder healer had told him. The boy hurried the final distance and handed up the cup. "I need ginger," Sandris said, handing back the stone cup. The boy breathed quickly, taking a moment to reply. "I beg your pardon, High Priest, but I already added it." Pontifex Sandris did not grace the whelp with praise. "Why, I did not will it then," he said. The boy recoiled, the mind behind the fear racing very hard. I... Grandmother is near your age, sir. She takes ginger in most anything she eats, Pontifex," he said. Sandris took a deep drink and found it to his liking. What wasn't to his liking was how little he recognized this boy. There was something familiar about him. "Whose son are you?" he rasped. He could be Sashaya's. He had the same expression as her. The same as a fish, for that matter, all big lips and vacant eyes. But this fish spoke. "Sir, I am Bari, son of Myrtis." Myrtis. The name rang like a wail in the wind. Now the Pontifex looked at the boy, this son of Myrtis. Myrtis. Tasted like bile. Bari was less than 2 decades old, less than 9 stone, and less than was expected. Not that Sandris had expected much. He had none of his father's dark, sharpened features. He was pink and plump as a peach, with sinewy hair matting his head. When his eyes darted up to see the Pontifex for a moment, Sandris's grey eyes were met with clear blue, the same as his father. "What is your heretic father doing, sending you here?" he asked. If the father hoped to use this boy as an olive branch, Sandris would use him for firewood. Gods knew how many tides came and left since someone had even mentioned the name, How many moons since they had spoken? Myrtis. He had left to counsel the aristocrats and lords and ladies in their stone prisons, removed from the touch of the wind or the gaze of the sun and moon. If he fulfilled those spiritually crippled fools' need for divine validation, so be it. But Sandris was Pontifex, not Myrtis. I'm here to assist you. I was told you were very, Dewdrops formed on Bari's brow. Old, Sandris said. The Pontifex finished his drink and gave the cup back to the boy. Yes, Pontifex, Bari said, bracing for the rebuke. Your father is a great fool. He knows nothing of the ways of the gods, nothing of the stars and earths and sky, and nothing of age. Should he be so lucky, he may yet learn of one of them. And may he be cursed with brittle knees, rebellious bowels, and the pestilence of the young and foolish, just as I have been, he thought bitterly. And you, where are your devotions? Between the legs of some city harlot, no doubt, like all the boys of your age, not yet men, but desperate to prove yourselves one. Sandris had no cause to berate the boy, but he couldn't afford to play the kindly elder to anyone, least of all this fool. Something about his meekness seemingly invited abuse. I wished to become a priest, Pontifex. Bari shrunk to one knee. Please, your tutelage would have, well, my father said that if there's one man in this land who could have helped me to become a man, sir, like you said, my father said that you would be that man. I came from the capital 2 full moons ago. I arrived here only 3 nights ago, he said to the old man. When he knelt, Sandris was a little taller than the boy. What game is this? Myrtis said that, did he, boy? Or is it simply what he told you to say? What would flatter the old fool most? Your damn father thinks I'm all but ready for my pyre, does he? He sent you to replace me? Well, you may tell him that I am in no need of a simple, smooth-skinned, capital priestling. I have my priests and priestesses attending me, that we may attend the gods, in peace. Scuttle off back to the capital, to your father, he said, each word more venomous than the last. Sandris looked down at the boy, the weight around his neck pulling him ever closer. He took the bone in his hand and drew it closer to his chest, alleviating some of the pain from his neck and shoulders. My father didn't send me, sir, Bari said, glancing up quickly. On that, the Pontifex prayed. He rubbed the ruin with his sweaty hands, tracing the deep cuts with his fingers. When he looked at it, it was as pale and cracked as his own skin. My blood, grant me patience. Then why are you here, boy? Wind from the Kunier threw straw-like hair into Bari's eyes. He pushed it aside when he finally spoke. I came to warn you, Bari said. His voice shook and his eyes welled, and soon he was trembling and weeping like a babe without breast. Sandris suffered it for a moment, but ended the child's moaning with the back of his hand, lashing the boy across the face. Sandris's own master's hand moved in his, it seemed. The boy fell dully towards the cliff, slapping fleshily onto the rock face. Still he wept, but he made no noise, lest he offend the prophet again. With a chilly breeze, news arrived, an unwelcome guest. Pontifex. It was Alimaya, shuffling towards him. Her shiften hood covered her body in brown, rough-spun wool. Her face, hands, and feet were visible, but nothing besides. What could be seen of her was pleasant. Gentle doe eyes, a thin mouth, and a nose that bent strangely at the middle. His wisest student, but not his oldest. Loss adds years to years. Now she looked distressed, but she remembered to bow twice before him, once for the man, and once for blood. He released the rune from his grip that she may see it when she bowed. If you do not know who you bow to, you are simply bending over, and you may only know for certain if you've seen. His master's voice came to Sandris through the many, many years. Still it was clear as day. Pontifex, master, in the monastery, there's a man, a stranger, she said, drawing him back to the present. Turn him away. Send this boy with him, he said, nodding to the carcass called Bari. No, she said. Unlike the boy, she had character enough to stand up to him. He is a priest. Kova says she found him while she was foraging, close to us, rambling about finding a sacrifice for the earths and sky. He said he came from the Cape of Whales. He says his own monastery was burned. She said. Sandris beckoned for her to rise, and she did so. Brigands. Godless mongrels. Did he say why it was burned? Sandris asked, stepping past the shivering cub and turning to look out over the sea. No, that was all we could gather from the ravings. What are we to do? She asked. He took a moment to simply be with the sea, to feel the cold breeze move his beard, to forget the brewing pain in his knees. So long had he been the voice of the gods for everyone else, he sometimes forgot to let them speak to him. Now he felt cold. The darkness wasn't complete, yet it wasn't bright. The pre-dawn gloom was void, neither night nor day. The sea and sky had melted into one shifting plain. Cloud and foam mixed, the wind howled and the sea roared. Two elemental behemoths at war. Or were they lovers, curled up in a primordial orgy? After staring for a long time, it became hard for him to tell which was sea and which was sky. Sky below and sea above. Sea below and sky above. A mind of madness. He opened his eyes. Alimaya hadn't moved or spoken, knowing to let him think and pray for as long as he needed. He is alone. No others came, the Pontifex said softly. Yes, he is the only one. Then turn him away. Madmen travel alone, spinning stories as fast as they... The boy blubbered something in interruption. But he isn't alone, Sandris thought, staring back down at the boy, who had since sat up. Boy, Pontifex Sandris said. He came when beckoned. What do you know of this? I know it's true. The story, he said, his eyes turned down. Sandris grabbed the boy's chin and turned it to face up. Look at me. How? I know because it happened to me. In the capital, our temple was burned. My brothers and sisters put to the knife. He spat the words out as quickly as he could. I was spared for my father's sake, but I fled. I came here, to the Pontifex, to blood. I know it is the work of a false faith. I know there will be more men like this. I know. What do you know, child? Alimaya asked. Her gentle nature helped to soothe Bari. He took in a few shuddering breaths before whispering, I know that they will do the same to this place, Pontifex. You're listening to Upstairs Neighbor, broadcasting through the facilities of Trent Radio, 92.7 CFFF FM. You're listening to Pontifex, a story that I wrote. If you want to hear more, check out my SoundCloud, Upstairs Neighbour Media. Ice floes drifted by, the last of the season. Pale blue and drifting serenely as clouds through the frigid sea. Dawn had yet to break, and his woolen shift offered no protection from the sheer wind. That simply meant the gods wanted him moving, if they were still there at all. He clutched blood closer to his chest. My knees may complain all they like. They work for me, and I must walk. so he drove himself onwards like a mule. The shell chain was cutting deeply into his skin now, drawing blood. It had eased since he took the rune in his hand, but it still pained him. Blood, gods, I need your sight, your strength, and I pray for a bit of your warmth. I need to hear from you. I need to feel you. If he could still feel the power from the rune, then his gods weren't dead, like the boy and madman had said. When the madman had seen the Pontifex, he ended his babbling and bowed. Sandris had remembered pride then, before he heard the news, and stood as tall as he could within Alimaya's tent. The space was full of jars and bottles, on shelves and in chests. Some held pickles or yogurt, others had reduced urine or fermenting berries. The majority, the Pontifex knew, was birch oil, which was useful in starting their nightly bonfires. The white, weedy birch trees were abundant around the monastery, and Alimaya had been stockpiling the stuff for several years. It was kept in large clay pots, each sealed with a thick layer of wax. "Pontifex," the madman said, "blood of my blood." He bowed, then bowed a second time, then twitched. "Well, I take it he is faithful. 2 stray priests at my heels, and it's not even dawn. Our own army, my brothers." The twitching had become shivering. For a while, he simply watched. This was no boy, but a man near as old as he, shivering with madness. A holy man. Who is he? Alimaya only looked shocked. He's been raving like an animal since he arrived. He spoke only sparingly. Sandris turned to speak to him. "What has happened, brother?" he asked. His heart was stamping like a hare. Thrum, 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 thrum. Why am I afraid? He clutched the bone closer to his chest, squeezing it hard. It was as if... My gods, where were they? Where were my gods, of earths and sky and star? He spoke in a fear-woven voice. He bowed low again to hide any tears. Refugees started arriving at dawn, first a trickle, then a torrent. Most were of his faith, all were ragged and exhausted as beasts of burden. Alimaya and the others gave what they could, but soon the meager reserves of foraged food were spent. Such a small camp wasn't meant to feed so many. There were many children who must have followed the migration of broken people all the way here. If the Pontifex was shaken, he didn't let them see. He helped where he could, but mostly he spoke to those who had... If the Pontifex was shaken, he didn't let them see. He helped where he could, but mostly he spoke to those who could still craft words after what they had seen. The story was the same. Monasteries pillaged and burned indiscriminately. Priestesses torn from their shrines. Novices killed by archers as they fled. Tents burned with people still inside. His people. By nightfall, the camp was overrun with faithful, more than had ever made the pilgrimage to his remote home before. All the spirit had been drained from his underlings, who sat and lay on the ground, exhausted. Out of habit, he moved to the great heap of wood where they lit their prayer fires. It was only when he tried to move the firewood he remembered his age, and noticed that no one was helping him. The sea take them. The gods endure all. Humans fear and whine and plan, he said. Someone sat at the edge of the cliff, rocking back and forth. They were covered by so many fabrics, Sandris couldn't make out if they were a man or woman. You there, serve your Pontifex. Build me a fire, he shouted with all his authority, but the mass of clothes didn't move except for their forward and backward swaying. Sandris approached the disobedient, whose muttering grew more audible with every step. The Pontifex couldn't parse the words, but the tone was clearly afraid. "Build me a fire," he said again, this time mere steps away. The woman, for it was a woman, turned to face him. Her eyes burned red from tears, her mouth and nose dripped, and her skin was scuffed with dirt and blood. She kept rocking, changing from hunched to erect and growing faster. "Can you hear, woman?" he asked, quietly, his anger failing him. She didn't answer. "I am your Pontifex. I am the god's avatar. Your power is spent, Pontifex." Her voice was calm and dead as a frozen lake. "Our gods are dead. They are. You are the avatar of nothing. I am the servant of nothing. There is only nothing," she said, repeating her final words over and over and over. Never had he suffered such a heresy, but his shock was complete when she rocked forward and fell. Without a scream, without a noise but the flapping of fabric, she was gone. Where moments before she had sat, all that remained was a pendant carved from fishbone. He picked it up, clutching blood tightly in his other hand. The bone had been smoothed from obsessive fondling, and still had warmth from her touch. The bottom of the cliff was hidden by night, but the Pontifex could see her body among the rocks and surf in his mind's eye. There is only nothing. That was what drove him out. He needed to be away, far away from the fearful tongues of men, to hear the wordless voices of the gods, of earth's and sky and star, if he still could. Now he was at the stony beach, cold in the morning stillness. It had taken him most of the moon's flight to reach the bottom of the cliffs, through the winding and treacherous path. In the dark, with his knees, the hiking progressed with glacial speed. He welcomed the feeling of salt air coming from the water and bouncing off the white cliffs. But the sea didn't taste as sweet. When his toes touched the shore, all he felt was cold. The walk had wearied him. His breath was hard, and his very bones were in agony. With shaking knees, the old man started to sway, back and forward. The gods had delivered him from a life of loneliness and fear, from his master's punishing rebukes, from mere mortality. "Help me, please." He clutched the rune and prayed to the sky, who sent her benevolence down to the earths as rain and snow. He thought of being a child, of trying to clap with the lightning flashes during storms. If you could do it, your prayer would come true. Even then he'd been a priestling. They were his life, the gods. As he fell, he reached out for them. Where were they? He hit the rocks, knees first, then his forearms, then his face was underwater. His cry of pain became bubbles in the Cunier Sea. He emerged, beard and face soaked, knees and arms bloody. He took in a gasp of air, as if the cold had forced a dagger into his ribs, burning and twisting. He yelled in pain, but it turned into a moaning wail. Nothing would soothe it. He reached for his rune, for blood. Empty air. He looked about him. Strewn in the water and stone, skulls of rats, mice, and gulls, seashells, some smeared with blood. A wave carried to him the face-down chunk of whalebone. Blood. Split in two. No. He grabbed blood, and the sharp edges bit into his palm. His own blood seemed black as the frozen sea. He dropped the shards at the pain, watched blood hit the wet pebbles, breaking waves dragged wet fingers around it. No! The gray beach was lightning, all rocks and ice and bones, and him. He stood shakily and took a step deeper into the sea, the two bone shards back in his bleeding fists. I will walk into the sea and join them. I do not wish to see the end through my living eyes. He walked slowly until his damned knees finally wavered. Then Pontifex Sandris crawled. For all men crawl before their gods. The air held a queer grayness, and dawn seemed never to come. So onward he crawled, slamming his fists into the submerged rocks. Salt water bit his palms like jellyfish. His beard was wet almost to the chin when his fist hit something. It was hard, but not like stone. Trembling, he brought the driftwood closer. It was his height, thick and white as snow. Sandris, with twitching fingers and a steadying heart, released blood from his hands and let the tide take the shards away. He didn't even look down. His eyes were fixed upward to the horizon. Dawn broke. Silver light exploded from the sea like a creature, beautiful and graceful. The warmth on his skin felt as good as God's. Fire danced in the ice, shining blue and white and gold. Fire from ice, burning away death, the seed of life. He understood. The shards of whalebone drifted away, out to sea. And soon, so will I. The driftwood made for a near-perfect walking stick, helping him a quarter of the way back. The top turned red from his bloody palms, the white wood absorbing the color eagerly. His path had been clear and warm in the dawn light, but he couldn't push himself too quickly. He had been resting when the boy found him. Bari, to his credit, hadn't been far behind. The boy bowed to the Pontifex, and again to blood, the dead rune. Sandris didn't stand or acknowledge the boy at all, but he spoke. "Boy," he said, his voice weak. "Pontifex, you're hurt and wet." "I know that all too well." "Boy," he said again, stronger this time. "My father is coming here, master," said Bari, a look of shame and fear in his eyes. Again, the whelp felt the back of Sandris's hand. "Don't interrupt me," he snapped. It wasn't so hard as to knock the boy over, but the slap left a bright red imprint and the promise of a bruise. "Help me back to camp. We have work to do." The boy slipped an arm under his master's shoulder and carried what little weight the old man offered. Slowly they made their way up the winding cliff paths, his staff clicking on the stone with every other step. The cliffs turned from blue to pale pink, and finally were white in the sunlight. His final dawn. "What work are we to do?" Bari asked. "Firewood, boy. When your hateful father arrives with his army, we will welcome him with open arms. Once you do that, I have another job for you." The monastery was boiling over with people, who now camped among the surrounding woods and hills. Wailing children and the commotion of humanity had found him again, despite all his efforts. They foraged through the forests and streams where he would meditate. They defecated in and defiled the sacred groves. He would have stopped it too. He would have commanded them to starve rather than offend the very source of life. But now he had perspective. "We need the gods more than they need us." "Strip the camp down. Gather all the firewood you can, anything that will burn," he told the boy, who tried to obey. Naturally, he couldn't muster the manpower, and soon the Pontifex was questioned personally. His priests and priestesses came to him, All bowed twice, except for Alimaya, who only bowed once. "Where is the rune? Where is blood?" she asked. The others murmured to each other as they noticed. Their eyes widened at his answer. "Destroyed," he said. Now Sandris related his story to them, of the beach and the destroyed relic. They grew pale as he continued, those who had been working all day to comfort and reassure people of their belief. When he finished, all of them looked as broken as blood had. "But it is not all despair. You who have been so loyal may yet provide a final sacrifice to the gods. Collect wood, anything with fire locked within. We may die, our temples and forests will be destroyed and cast to the wind. But our gods survive. They rise and fall like the spheres of sun and the moon and star, and they will know who loved them before the end." His clerics went to obey, but he grabbed the boy before he could leave again. "You, get these people away from here before your father arrives. Lead them away from these gods and back into life. Do as I say. I shall be the last Pontifex of star and moon and earth. Show them life after the gods, or show them an easy death, if that is their wish," he said. The boy would have sputtered some complaint if he hadn't been shoved off by the old man, who now sought solitude. "Never truly alone," he thought, as the wind touched him deeper and sweeter than it ever had before. The sun had warmed the day when they arrived. Sandris could see their banners and the tops of their spears from his perch atop the mound of wood. Limbs and trunks from many trees were added to the pyre. Ash, cedar, oak, but none more than birch. Of all the myriad plants, Sandris thought that birch coveted fire the most. The pyre was as tall as 2 men and elevating slowly. Sandris had never seen the main sigil before, a white sickle on a black field. He searched for the birch branches, carried with the heraldry to represent the gods and the earths, but the horizon was a bleak sea of black and white lances, with banners rippling like fish swimming upriver through the breeze. For all the cruelty of the gods, they had granted him one final mercy. The hum and whine of humanity had been replaced by silence, and a queer feeling in the air, like a storm was approaching. His disciples had put in the hard work required to build such a huge pile. Tents and sticks and dead trees, work he could only have done decades ago. Alimaya doused as much of the wood as possible in birch oil and other alchemies to help the young fire along. Her entire stockpile went into a single fire until every twig was soaked. There was no need to conserve resources anymore. While they worked, he chanted a familiar prayer and carved familiar runes into his staff. Some for sea, some for sun, some for ice. He told them to commune with the gods one more time in the sacred groves, where still they lay and waited. He drove his knife into the birchwood and wrought the spiraling rune that meant birch. The gods had only granted him a stick to fill the gap that blood had left. Such an object was one of a kind, more valuable and more powerful than any human could ever hope to be. It was a piece of the gods, and it had their magic, and they had replaced it with a stick. But he knew, Pontifex Sandris knew, that the gods gave you all that you need so long as you provide sacrifice. He had given the gods his life, his mind, his soul, his body, and his blood. That meant all he needed was a stick to complete his destiny, a thread that had grown long and frayed as his own beard. "What an end I shall have," he thought. for he was the bridge between men and the gods. It was him who needed to die, not the people who simply wanted to live in peace with the divine. The boy didn't argue when assigned his task, but Sandris only hoped that trusting the boy wouldn't backfire. Sandris had thought that if there was enough Myrtis in him, he would make a fine leader. The boy clearly wasn't apt to be a threat in the long term. Not that the Pontifex had a long term. If those who had been loyal to him find peace in this world after him, in this world after the gods, then some harm might be spared the innocents of the world. They would be the sacrifice that allowed such a world, and Myrtis would wield the ceremonial blade. Gods and mortals would take note. Shapes broke forward from the massive cavalry, bearing the open white of peace on one lance, and the unfamiliar standard on the center tallest lance. The final rider carried a single branch of silver birch, the only representation of the faith. It made Sandris laugh. I half expected Myrtis to bring my monks' heads on his pikes. The envoy rode closer and closer, approaching at a canter the foot of Sandris's wooden mound. Their heads lay at his feet, even atop their horses. They wore a queer sort of metal on their bodies as armor, but he did not recognize it. Even the standard bearer of the birch wore armor, against the laws of their faith. Holy men wore no armor and carried no weapons. The Pontifex had almost forgotten. That didn't matter anymore. When the envoy removed their helms, it was Myrtis himself who sat before him. Could that be you, Sandris, under all that hair and all those wrinkles? You were old even when you were young, in spirit if not in body. The gods will twist your entrails from your flesh and grind your teeth into sand, the Pontifex said, but his enemy only laughed. A dead god has no wrath, old man, just as a dead old man has no gods. That is what I've done, killed your gods. If our great kingdom is going to spread and grow as it must, then we need to start putting the needs of our people above the wants of old gods. They were the biggest barrier between us and greatness. It's easier for a peasant to till a field or fell a tree if it lacks a soul. The old gives way to the new, so it has been since the dawn of time. He gloats. How long he's been waiting for this, I can only fear to guess. How blind he has become, how deaf to his own heart. You needn't die, though, Sandris. You are wise and have a cunning that has not dulled. I offer you your life, and perhaps even the lives of those willing to comply among your disciples. Change doesn't have to be violence. Metamorphosis is possible, even for you. You have until sundown to make your peace, not that they will forgive you. With that, the Pontifex turned and sat to face the sea and wait for the sun to set behind him. The riders took it as their cue to leave, and did so. One by one, his followers appeared from the forest. He told them only to return when they felt they were ready. He told them they were free not to return, but to do so was to renounce the gods. To return is to die for them. Alimaya came back from the south, from where her husband and boy were buried. That was far away, but she swore it was the most beautiful place in the world. A grove of ash trees, with 2 graves in the center of the clearing, side by side. Everyone got to choose how they went into the next world. Some went out in boats to sea, some wander into the woods to freeze or be eaten by animals. His would be the way of fire. Sashaya returned with red eyes. She had sent her young daughter with Bari, something not many would do. Her eldest girl, Kova, stayed with her. She had been zealous and taught her children well the power of the gods. Now she was subdued, pale in the face of death. Now mother and daughter sat wordlessly, holding each other. The Pontifex never moved, though his stomach complained and he found himself thinking of food when he meant to be meditating. He had fasted for 7 days when he was young and communed with the spirits and read the stars. He paid no mind to his hunger, releasing his tethers to the earths. At evenfall they lit the torches. Everyone was given a piece of flame and a place atop the pile. Some waited at the bottom. At evenfall they lit the torches. Everyone was given a piece of flame and a place atop the pile. Some waited at the bottom. Sandris held his driftwood torch in his hand, standing to meet the host. Myrtis came when night was complete. The host marched in full force to the foot of his wooden hill, where the priests had started to chant. It was unlike the music they made only days ago, chaotic and swirling as the storm. This was somber, a low, continuous note that seemed to keep the fear out of their hearts. Myrtis must have expected some trap, as the host made its way cautiously forward with clanging metal steps. Myrtis rode at the head, swaggering as if he commanded the rolling storm clouds and the thunder itself. Finally they arrived, pausing at the sight of the Pontifex and his disciples. Sandris closed his eyes and chanted, the heat from his torch emboldening him against his demise. End it. With that, the soldiers began to cut down his defenseless priests. The chanting grew faint as the voices grew fewer, and the infantry clambered up the pile to their quarry. Sandris kept his eyes closed until he could bear to no longer. He saw as they stabbed Alimaya, whose chant turned into a groan, then into silence. The torches fell from limp fingers and rolled down to the ground, or else into the churning sea. No wood caught. A fine death, so long as the gods grant us justice, he thought, as the final chanter fell silent. Now it was he alone who defied the great host, chanting in his low, deep, scarred voice. None of the men dared kill him, though they surrounded him with spearheads. He stared deep into the eyes of every one of them, so he might continue his vengeance in the next world. All of them bore the look of fear, the same fear that drove them here, that bound them to Myrtis. One even bowed his head before pointing the spear with renewed conviction. The crowd parted to let their commander pass to the front. He approached, sword in hand, and looked into the Pontifex's eyes. As splinters filled his feet, and the man he hated smiled in victory, Sandris thought he felt the familiar sting of blood digging into his neck and shoulders. Men are frogs, he had been told, who move between the spirit world and the earths, as from pond to shore. Myrtis placed the tip of his sword on the old man's belly and pushed. His knees failed, and the wind was driven from him. Sandris's fingers relaxed, and his driftwood torch fell to the ground. Blood of... Now smoke was filling the air again, as it had for endless nights of the past. Chaos reigned as the fires spread from the torch to ignite the pyre. Soldiers tripped over each other as heat and smoke cursed their vision and burned their lungs. Alimaya's alchemy had worked, and the fire spread faster than the army could retreat. They had sacrificed his monks to their new gods. Now he sacrificed them to his old ones. When Myrtis turned to flee, Sandris grabbed his killer by the throat and squeezed with what remained of his spirit. After a few moments, he could choke him no longer, but it was enough. Chants were replaced by wails of terror as the fire gods proved what the Pontifex knew. You don't need to respect fire for it to burn you. The gods are powerful and eternal, no matter the foolishness of man. All around him, tongues of fire rose and danced. Somehow he could only watch as his body turned to air. There was no feeling. He saw the flesh fall from his bones and rise as white ash into the spinning air. He saw his beard wither and blacken, as if reversing the progress of time. The screams faded beneath the roar of fire, and Pontifex Sandris was given to the stars, the sea, and to the earths. Such is the way of fire.
Yeah, it took the whole hour like
Nice,
that,
it's
eh?
on. Good timing.
Thanks. Well, I really focused on it, you know?
Nice.
Whew.
Looks really great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, I'll stop the recording, eh?
Yeah.